Before the headlines, before the lawsuits, before the world began to see Harvey Weinstein for who he really was, Ashley Judd was already carrying the weight of what had happened behind the scenes. She was not just another actress in Hollywood. She was one of its most promising stars, intelligent, poised, critically acclaimed. She had all the makings of a long and respected career. But something had gone terribly wrong, something that didn't make sense to anyone on the outside. The roles dried up, the offers became scarce, and no one could explain why. Ashley Judd could. It began with a meeting, like so many stories do in Hollywood. A meeting that should have been about opportunity, progress, potential. But instead, it became a moment of violation, subtle but scarring. In the late 1990s, she was invited to Weinstein's hotel suite under the pretense of a business discussion. What followed, according to Ashley, was a disturbing attempt at coercion. Weinstein allegedly asked for a massage. He suggested she watch him shower. She declined. She escaped. But she didn't walk away untouched. The damage had already begun, not just to her sense of safety, but to her future. For years, Ashley kept the experience to herself, choosing silence like so many others. Unsure whether her voice would make a difference in an industry where power protected the predator. She continued to act, continued to show up on red carpets, continued to smile for cameras. But behind the scenes, her career was taking a turn she couldn't control. Prominent directors who once praised her now stopped returning her calls. Studios that had offered her leading roles suddenly passed her over. It wasn't just a shift, it was sabotage. She didn't have proof, not then, but in her heart, she knew. Harvey Weinstein had blacklisted her. In 2017, when the New York Times and the New Yorker exposed Weinstein's long history of sexual abuse, Ashley Judd was among the first women to go on record. Her story was one of many, but it carried particular weight. She had been warning about him quietly for years. She had experienced the subtle punishment that came with saying no. And now, with the truth emerging in tidal waves, she no longer had to whisper. She could roar, and she did. In April 2018, Ashley Judd took the step that would solidify her place in the legal reckoning of the Weinstein empire. She filed a lawsuit. It wasn't just about what had happened in that hotel suite. It was about what came after. About how Weinstein, a man with unchecked power, allegedly weaponized that power to destroy her career in retaliation for rejecting him. She sued him for defamation and sexual harassment, claiming that after she refused his advances, he told director Peter Jackson and others that she was a nightmare to work with, effectively blacklisting her from one of the biggest movie franchises in history, the Lord of the Rings. That franchise would go on to define a generation of filmmaking and launch careers. But Ashley, whose name had once been part of the casting discussions, was quietly pushed out. No public explanation, no scandal, just erasure. Her lawsuit wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about challenging the idea that women should be grateful for silence, that they should accept the cost of standing up for themselves, that powerful men should walk away from their abuses unscathed while their victims vanish from the spotlight. The backlash, of course, was swift. There were whispers that she was doing it for attention, that she had no evidence, that her career decline had other causes. But Ashley stood firm. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing justice. She was tired of pretending that what had happened to her was just part of the cost of doing business. It wasn't. It was a betrayal, a theft of her professional future, and she wanted the world to know. Throughout the legal process, Ashley carried herself with remarkable dignity. She didn't break down in public. She didn't lash out at her critics. She used her platform to speak not just about Weinstein, but about the larger culture that allowed him to operate for so long. She talked about institutional complicity, about the way Hollywood worshipped power, about the silence of those who knew but chose not to act. And as she spoke, more women found their voices. She became a symbol, not just of survival, but of strength. And still, the pain was real. The loss of years, of role, of opportunities that should have been hers. It wasn't just about money or fame. It was about legacy, about the body of work she could have built, the characters she could have brought to life, the audiences she could have moved, all of it stolen in a moment of ego and cruelty. But Ashley refused to be defined by that loss. Instead, she chose to redefine herself. She went back to school. She engaged in humanitarian work. She gave speeches that inspired millions. And through it all, she kept fighting, not just in courtrooms, but in the hearts and minds of those who still struggled to believe that the cost of speaking up was worth it. Because for Ashley Judd, the cost had been everything. But the silence would have cost more. There are few things more painful than knowing you were right, but having to watch the world pretend you weren't for years. That was Ashley Judd's reality. Every red carpet she wasn't invited to, every major role she didn't get, every meeting she never knew she missed, each of them became a ghost, a haunting reminder of what was taken from her, not by accident, but by design. She didn't fall out of favor. She was pushed. When director Peter Jackson came forward and admitted that he had indeed removed Ashley Judd and Mira Sorvino from consideration for The Lord of the Rings after speaking with people connected to Harvey Weinstein, Ashley's worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't self-doubt. It was sabotage. Jackson didn't know the full story at the time. He was told that Judd was difficult, that she had attitude problems, that she wasn't worth the risk, but in hindsight, he realized he had been manipulated. Weinstein had poisoned the well, ensuring that Ashley's name was crossed out before she ever walked into the room. Ashley's lawsuit aimed to reveal just how deep that poison ran. In her complaint, she stated that Weinstein's actions not only damaged her reputation, but caused her to lose future income and employment opportunities, violating California law prohibiting sexual harassment in professional relationships. But more than a legal violation, it was a personal devastation. It's one thing to fight for your place in a cutthroat industry. It's another thing entirely to be eliminated from that fight before it even begins. In interviews, Ashley was candid. She didn't speak in sound bites. She spoke in truths, and sometimes those truths were painful. She described the psychological impact of realizing that your rejection of a man's advances could cost you your future, that your self-worth could become a liability, that dignity could be punished in a world that praised obedience. The emotional weight was not abstract. It was carved into the arc of her career. There were films she never got to audition for, scripts she never saw, co-stars she never met, and fans who, unknowingly, never got to see the performances she had in her. The grief wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For an artist, the loss of expression is like the loss of breath. But Ashley never lost her voice. As the case moved forward, it became clear that she was not just fighting for herself. She was opening a path for others to follow. Her lawsuit was one of the first of its kind, and it tested the limits of the law's ability to hold powerful men accountable for what happened outside the physical act of assault. This was about the aftermath, about the invisible scar, about how reputations can be murdered with whispers. She wanted the court to recognize what so many victims knew instinctively, that retaliation didn't always look like threats or violence. Sometimes it looked like being shut out, like a door quietly closing, like an offer that never came. And the people who pulled those strings often did so with plausible deniability, their hands always clean. But Ashley was determined to show the fingerprints. And the industry was watching. The lawsuit sparked a wave of conversations in studios and production companies. Who else had been blacklisted? Who else had been quietly erased? It forced people to look at the casting process not just as an artistic decision, but as a site of systemic discrimination. And it forced them to ask how many women were missing from our screens because they had the courage to say no. Meanwhile, Harvey Weinstein's empire continued to crumble. More women came forward. More lawsuits were filed. He was arrested. He was tried. He was convicted. And through it all, Ashley Judd stood tall, not because she felt triumphant, but because she felt responsible. She knew that her decision to speak had helped turn the tide, and yet she carried it all with humility. She often spoke about the power of testimony, how speaking out wasn't just about getting justice for yourself, it was about creating space for others to do the same. She talked about the ripple effect of truth, that when one woman stands up, others find their footing, and that was what she wanted more than anything. For other women to stop blaming themselves, to stop questioning their memories, to stop carrying shame that didn't belong to them. She also talked about the trauma of being disbelieved, of being gaslit by an entire industry, of being made to feel crazy for naming what everyone else refused to see. It wasn't just Weinstein's actions that broke her, it was the silence that followed, the complicity, the cowardice, the way people looked away when they could have spoken up. And perhaps the deepest pain of all was that some of them were women. Ashley never claimed to be perfect. She admitted to her own moments of doubt and despair, but she never let those moments stop her. She kept showing up. In court, in interviews, in support groups. Her courage wasn't in never feeling afraid, it was in speaking anyway. And slowly, the world began to listen. The legal proceedings were long and exhausting. Motions were filed, arguments made, questions raised about jurisdiction, about legal definitions, about what constitutes career damage. But behind all the legal language was a very human truth. A woman's future had been stolen because she dared to say no. Ashley Judd didn't sue for fame. She already had that. She sued for dignity, for acknowledgement, for the right to be heard and believed. And as the legal gears turned, something even more powerful began to happen. She became a beacon, not just for women in Hollywood, but for women everywhere who had been pushed aside, shut down, or shut out for speaking their truth. She reminded the world that some wounds don't bleed, that some scars are written in missed calls and closed doors, that some violations are quiet, but just as cruel. As the lawsuit continued, Ashley Judd found herself standing at the intersection of two worlds, one that celebrated her bravery and another that still tried to dismiss her pain. On the surface, the media painted her as a feminist icon, a face of the movement, a survivor who refused to back down. But behind closed doors, there was a different reality, one of isolation, exhaustion, and relentless internal reckoning. The fight was never just about Weinstein. It was about the system, the agents who went quiet after she said no, the producers who suddenly lost interest, the so-called allies who avoided eye contact at award shows. Each betrayal, each omission left a mark. Her lawsuit wasn't only about clearing her name, it was about reclaiming her worth in an industry that had tried to devalue her. Ashley wasn't just a plaintiff. She was a woman attempting to piece together a future that had been fractured in silence. And yet, as the months dragged into years, she kept showing up. Her speeches became more powerful, her words more precise. In every courtroom update, every advocacy appearance, there was a quiet fury behind her grace. A reminder that dignity isn't passive. It's an act of rebellion in a world that rewards compliance. There were moments of vulnerability, too. Ashley spoke about the mental toll of pursuing justice, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the fear of being reduced to just another case. But she reminded herself and the world that her story mattered, that behind every headline was a woman who still had to wake up every day and live with what happened. She wasn't alone. Mira Sorvino, another actress blacklisted after allegedly rejecting Weinstein, publicly supported Ashley's claim. Peter Jackson's confession validated what many had long suspected, that Weinstein's influence didn't end with his own studio. He had reach, he had power, and he used it not just to exploit women, but to erase them. Still, the lawsuit faced hurdles. Weinstein's legal team was aggressive. They questioned timelines, disputed claims, and tried to shift focus away from their client's behavior and onto Ashley's supposed professional shortcomings. But the public was no longer buying it. The tide had turned. People were starting to understand that success in Hollywood often had less to do with talent and more to do with submission, and Ashley had refused to submit. In every interview, she made it clear that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a cultural reckoning. She called for transparency in hiring practices, for industry watchdogs, for a world where women could speak out without being blacklisted. Her activism wasn't reactive, it was visionary. She wanted to build something better, not just tear down what was broken, and still she grieved. She grieved the roles she would never play, the stories she would never tell, the characters that would never be brought to life through her voice, her soul. She grieved the years she spent wondering what she did wrong, when in truth, all she did was protect herself. The public began to rally behind her, not in a performative way, but with genuine admiration. She was no longer just the woman who sued Weinstein. She was the woman who stood in the fire and refused to burn. Young actors began to cite her as an inspiration. Advocates used her case to demand reform. And survivors, thousands of them, wrote to her, thanking her for giving them courage. Ashley read their letters. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed. Always, she responded with her presence, even if only in spirit, because she knew what it meant to feel invisible. She had lived it, and she was determined to make sure others wouldn't. as the legal process trudged on. Ashley continued her humanitarian work, traveling to war zones and refugee camps. The contrast was sharp. One moment she was in a courtroom, reliving trauma. The next, she was in a tent, holding a child displaced by violence. But in both spaces, her mission was the same, to give voice to the voiceless. Her resilience became her message, not perfection, not polished strength, but the kind of strength that survives in the aftermath, that picks up the shattered pieces and keeps going, that demands to be seen, even when the world looks away. In many ways, Ashley Judd had already won, not because the courts had ruled in her favor, but because she had never let them silence her. Her voice, her story, her truth, these were her victories. And in a world where so many women never get that chance, she made sure hers counted. Weinstein's criminal convictions piled up, and the world finally began to understand the extent of his crimes. Ashley remained composed. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She mourned for the years lost, for the women hurt, for the world that let it happen. She knew that her case might never make headlines the way others had. It wasn't about graphic details or courtroom drama. It was about power, about how it's used, about how it's abused, and about what it means to speak truth to it. She didn't care about being remembered as a hero. She cared about being heard, and in that, she had already carved her legacy. By the time Ashley Judd stepped fully into the role of a public advocate for survivors, she had long since shed the need to be accepted by Hollywood. She had made peace with the fact that the world she once adored had betrayed her, had cast her aside for the sin of setting boundaries. What remained now was purpose, and it burned in her with quiet, unrelenting intensity. Every appearance she made, every panel she sat on, every survivor she listened to became a thread in the tapestry she was weaving, one of redemption, not just for herself, but for all who had been ignored, manipulated, or erased. She no longer needed a stage to perform. Her life had become her platform, and she used it with radical honesty. In 2019, a judge dismissed parts of her lawsuit, ruling that while she had presented a strong case of retaliation, her claims of sexual harassment under California law didn't qualify due to the timeline of events. For many, it would have been a crushing blow, but Ashley responded with grace and determination. She wasn't finished. She continued to pursue the defamation and retaliation aspects of the lawsuit, and she did so knowing that the legal system wasn't built to protect people like her. Not really. Not yet. But that didn't mean she would stop trying to change it. Ashley made it clear that the dismissal of one claim did not equal the dismissal of her truth. Her story had already shifted public consciousness. The words she spoke had inspired legislation, activism, and awareness. And even if the courts couldn't fully recognize the damage Weinstein had done, the world had. She kept showing up. She kept fighting. She participated in global conversations about gender-based violence, addressing world leaders and humanitarian organizations. Her voice carried beyond Hollywood into places where women's voices were rarely heard. And every time she stood in front of a microphone, she did so with the memory of the moment she said no in that hotel suite. How it had nearly broken her career, but had not broken her soul. In interviews, she was raw but resolute. She spoke about therapy, about the long nights of doubt, about the physical and emotional toll of living in survival mode. But she also spoke about healing, about community, about finding joy again, not in the applause of the industry, but in moments of real connection. The survivors she met, the activists she supported, the students who studied her case as an example of how power can be challenged. Hollywood had moved on, as it always does. New headlines, new faces, new scandals. But Ashley remained, rooted in something deeper than fame. Her presence was not performative. It was grounded, lived in, earned, and she still believed in accountability. She called out performative allyship. She refused to celebrate people who wore pins one year and worked with known abusers the next. She exposed the industry's hypocrisy, and for that, she remained a polarizing figure. But she didn't care. She didn't come to be liked. She came to tell the truth. She spoke of the many forms justice can take. For some, it's a guilty verdict. For others, it's a simple acknowledgement. I believe you. For her, justice had become a mosaic. Some, parts clear and others shattered, but still forming something whole. She would never get those lost years back, but she could use what time remained to build something better for those coming after her. She often reflected on what her life might have looked like had she never entered that hotel room? Had she never met Harvey Weinstein? Had she never been forced to carry the weight of retaliation disguised as rejection? Would she have become an Oscar winner? A household name? Would she have been cast in The Lord of the Rings and gone on to lead franchises? She would never know. But what she did know was this: that even if she had been erased from certain roles, she had stepped into the most important one of her life: truth-teller, advocate, warrior, and perhaps that mattered more. By 2021, as Weinstein's legal fate unraveled in high-profile trials, Ashley's presence in the movement she helped ignite had shifted. She was no longer at the center of the conversation, and that was okay. Her work had already been done. She had held the door open. She had stood up when it wasn't safe. She had gone first. Others were now walking through the door she had kicked open, and she watched them with pride. Some she mentored quietly. Others she simply supported from afar. But in all of it, her fingerprints remained on every policy change, on every survivor-led production, on every headline that read "Justice Served." Her case was still alive, and she still hoped for accountability in the courtroom. But she no longer needed a verdict to validate her. She had found something stronger than legal satisfaction. She had found peace, and in a world that had once made her question her worth, peace was everything. Ashley Judd's story doesn't end with a courtroom verdict. It doesn't end with a single headline or a one-time victory. It continues in every woman who finds her voice because of what Ashley did. In every conversation that starts with, "Did you hear what she went through?" and ends with, "She never gave up." Her legacy is not just in what she endured, but in how she rose. By 2022, Ashley's lawsuit had cleared another legal hurdle. A federal appeals court revived her sexual harassment claim, stating that her professional relationship with Weinstein, at the time of the alleged misconduct, did in fact fall within the scope of California's harassment law. It was a quiet but profound moment, a reversal that acknowledged what survivors like Ashley had long argued, that harassment and retaliation aren't always contained to direct employment. Sometimes the abuse happens in hotel suites, long before contracts are signed. Sometimes it happens when a powerful man whispers lies that shut doors for years. This legal revival gave Ashley something the original dismissal did not: validation. It meant the court was listening, that maybe, slowly, the system was learning how to hear women. But by then, Ashley had already moved forward, not in forgetting, but in living. She leaned further into her advocacy, especially in global spaces. She worked with organizations combating gender-based violence in war zones. She walked through refugee camps. She listened. She carried the weight of others' trauma beside her own. And in doing so, she rediscovered what she had nearly lost: her faith in humanity. In 2022, she suffered another deeply personal loss: the death of her mother, country music legend Naomi Judd. The grief was seismic, but even in her mourning, Ashley modeled strength. She spoke about mental health, about suicide, about compassion. She stood at her mother's memorial service and addressed a nation watching with aching hearts. She was not performing. She was present, real, human. And in that moment, she reminded the world once again, she was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a survivor, a force. Her lawsuit against Weinstein was not about vengeance. It was about reclaiming her name, reclaiming the years that had been stolen, reclaiming the voice she had been told to lower. And whether or not the legal outcome ever brought her the justice she deserved, she had already changed the conversation forever. Ashley Judd became proof that you can speak truth to power and live to tell the story. She never asked to become the symbol of a movement, but she embraced it with courage. She didn't wait for the world to make space for her. She took it. And in doing so, she made space for others. Women who were watching from afar, wondering if their pain mattered. Women who had buried their stories deep, afraid no one would believe them. Women who feared that saying no meant losing everything. Ashley showed them that sometimes you do lose everything, and still, you can rise. Her career may never look like it did in the 90s, but perhaps that's the point. Perhaps her most important role wasn't played on a screen, but on the stage of truth. Her voice was not scripted. Her courage wasn't edited for the screen. It was real, unfiltered, and it rang louder than any line she'd ever delivered. When future generations look back on the Me Too era, they will see many names, but they will see Ashley Judd near the beginning. Not because she spoke the loudest, but because she spoke first. Because she stood alone until others found their strength. Because she walked into a courtroom, not just to win a case, but to prove that silence could be broken, even if it hurt. And in the end, that is the story that will endure. Not that she was blacklisted, not that she was slandered, not that she was pushed out of a film franchise that defined a decade, but that she refused to vanish, that she reclaimed her voice, that she reclaimed her name, that she turned survival into legacy.